Benjamin Franklin was a Boston printer and a brilliant inventor who became one of the founding fathers of America. Benjamin Franklin, statesman, scientist, and philosopher, was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 17, 1706. He came from humble beginnings as the 15th child of 17 children. Franklin's father was a soap and candle maker. The family was poor but respectable. Young Benjamin showed an early aptitude for reading and writing. He attended school for only 2 years, from age 8 to 10, before his father could no longer afford the tuition. At age 10, Benjamin left school to work in his father's shop, cutting wicks and pouring wax. He hated the work. At age 12, his father apprenticed him to his older brother James, who owned a printing shop. Benjamin Franklin found his calling in the printing trade. He read voraciously, teaching himself through books. He studied writing style by copying essays from a British magazine called The Spectator and then rewriting them from memory. Young Franklin was developing the clear, concise writing style that would make him famous. Benjamin Franklin and his brother James did not get along. James was harsh and demanding. In 1722, James started a newspaper called the New England Courant. Benjamin wanted to write for the paper, but James refused to publish his younger brother's work. So Benjamin created a fictional character, a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood, and submitted letters under this pseudonym. The Silence Dogood letters were witty and insightful, commenting on life in colonial Boston. They became very popular. James published 16 Silence Dogood letters before Benjamin revealed that he was the author. James was furious. The relationship between the brothers deteriorated further. In 1723, at age 17, Benjamin Franklin ran away from his apprenticeship and left Boston. He traveled to Philadelphia with almost no money in his pockets. Franklin arrived in Philadelphia dirty and disheveled, carrying nothing but a few clothes. He walked through the streets eating a large puffy roll, looking every bit the runaway apprentice. But Philadelphia would become his home and the place where he would make his fortune. Franklin found work as a printer and quickly impressed his employers with his skill and intelligence. He was ambitious and hardworking. Within a few years, he had saved enough money to open his own printing shop. In 1729, Franklin purchased a struggling newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. Under his leadership, the newspaper became the most successful in the colonies. Franklin filled it with news, essays, and advertisements. He wrote much of the content himself, using various pseudonyms. His writing was clever, entertaining, and accessible to common people. In 1730, Franklin entered into a common-law marriage with Deborah Read, a woman he had known since his first days in Philadelphia. Deborah was a practical, hard-working woman who helped Franklin run his printing business. They had 2 children together, and Franklin also had an illegitimate son named William from a previous relationship. Deborah raised William as her own. The Franklin household was busy and productive. In 1732, Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac under the pseudonym Richard Saunders. The almanac contained weather predictions, poems, proverbs, and practical advice. Franklin filled it with witty sayings that became part of American culture. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. These proverbs reflected Franklin's philosophy of hard work, thrift, and common sense. Poor Richard's Almanac was published annually for 25 years and made Franklin wealthy and famous throughout the colonies. By his early 40s, Franklin had become one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. He owned a successful printing business, a newspaper, and published the Almanac. He also operated a bookstore and a general store. Franklin was a shrewd businessman who understood that success came from providing value to customers and building a good reputation. But Franklin was not content to simply make money. He wanted to improve himself and improve his community. In 1727, Franklin founded a discussion group called the Junto, which brought together young tradesmen to debate philosophy, politics, and business. The Junto became an important institution in Philadelphia, fostering civic improvement and intellectual growth. Franklin believed strongly in self-improvement and created a system for developing what he called the 13 virtues, including temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He kept a chart and marked his progress daily, trying to perfect one virtue at a time. Franklin's civic contributions to Philadelphia were remarkable. He founded the first lending library in America in 1731, believing that access to books would help ordinary people educate themselves. He organized the first volunteer fire department in Philadelphia. He helped establish a hospital, an academy that would become the University of Pennsylvania, and a philosophical society for the advancement of knowledge. Franklin believed that citizens had a responsibility to improve their communities. He was a practical man who saw problems and worked to solve them. Philadelphia's streets were dirty, so Franklin organized a street cleaning service. The city needed better lighting, so Franklin designed improved street lamps. He was always thinking, always innovating, always trying to make life better for people. In 1748, at age 42, Franklin retired from active business to devote himself to science and public service. He had made enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Now he wanted to pursue his intellectual interests. Franklin had always been curious about the natural world. He began conducting experiments with electricity, a mysterious force that was poorly understood at the time. Franklin's experiments with electricity made him world famous. He proved that lightning was electrical in nature through his famous kite experiment in 1752. Franklin flew a kite during a thunderstorm with a metal key attached to the string. When lightning struck near the kite, sparks jumped from the key, proving that lightning was electricity. This was an incredibly dangerous experiment that could have killed him. But it revolutionized the understanding of electricity and led to Franklin's invention of the lightning rod, a metal rod placed on top of buildings to protect them from lightning strikes. The lightning rod saved countless buildings and lives. Franklin's electrical experiments earned him honorary degrees from Harvard and Yale and membership in the Royal Society of London, Britain's most prestigious scientific organization. Franklin made many other inventions and discoveries. He invented the Franklin stove, an efficient heating device that provided more warmth while using less fuel. He invented bifocal glasses, which allowed people to see both near and far without changing spectacles. He studied ocean currents and created one of the first maps of the Gulf Stream. He experimented with cooling effects of evaporation. He studied population growth and demographics. Franklin's mind ranged across many subjects. He was the embodiment of the Enlightenment ideal, a man who believed that through reason and observation, humans could understand nature and improve society. Franklin never patented his inventions. He believed that innovation should be freely shared for the benefit of all humanity. This generosity of spirit was typical of Franklin's character. As Franklin's fame grew, he was drawn increasingly into politics. In 1751, he was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. He proved to be a skilled politician who could build coalitions and negotiate compromises. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent Franklin to London to represent the colony's interests before the British government. This began Franklin's career as a diplomat, a role in which he would serve with distinction for much of the rest of his life. Franklin spent most of the next 18 years in London, serving as an agent for Pennsylvania and eventually for other colonies as well. He lived comfortably in London, enjoying the intellectual and social life of the great city. He made many friends among British scientists, politicians, and thinkers. But Franklin's mission was serious. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies was deteriorating. Britain was imposing new taxes on the colonies to pay for the French and Indian War. The colonists resented these taxes, arguing that they should not be taxed without representation in Parliament. Franklin initially tried to find a middle ground between Britain and America. He loved England and hoped for reconciliation. He testified before Parliament against the Stamp Act, a tax on printed materials that enraged the colonists. Franklin's testimony was eloquent and persuasive, and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But Britain continued to assert its authority over the colonies through new taxes and regulations. Franklin gradually came to believe that America and Britain could not remain united. The turning point came in 1774 when Franklin was publicly humiliated before the British Privy Council. He had leaked letters written by the Royal Governor of Massachusetts that showed the governor encouraging Britain to take a harder line against the colonies. British officials accused Franklin of being a thief and a traitor. He stood silently while they berated him for an hour. Franklin left that chamber convinced that America must separate from Britain. He returned to Philadelphia in 1775, just as the Revolutionary War was beginning. Franklin, now 69 years old, immediately threw himself into the cause of American independence. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress. He served on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, working alongside Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and others. Franklin made important contributions to the document, though Jefferson was the primary author. When the Declaration was signed on August 2, 1776, Franklin reportedly said, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." This was typical of Franklin's wit even in the most serious moments. The signing of the Declaration made all of them traitors to the British Crown, punishable by death. In 1776, Congress sent Franklin to France to seek French support for the American Revolution. This was the most important diplomatic mission in American history. Without French military and financial aid, the American Revolution would likely have failed. Franklin was 70 years old, suffering from gout and kidney stones, but he undertook the dangerous ocean voyage to France. He would remain in France for 9 years, and his mission there would prove to be one of the greatest diplomatic triumphs in history. Franklin arrived in France already famous as a scientist and philosopher. The French adored him. They saw him as the embodiment of American virtue and simplicity. Franklin played this role brilliantly. He wore a fur cap instead of a fashionable wig. He presented himself as a simple man of nature from the American wilderness, though in reality he was one of the most sophisticated men of his age. The French court was charmed. Franklin became a celebrity in Paris. His image appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, and prints. Women of the French court competed for his attention. But beneath the social whirl, Franklin was working tirelessly for the American cause. He negotiated with French officials, seeking military aid, loans, and supplies for the Continental Army. He managed a network of agents and spies. He arranged for French volunteers to join the American Army. He oversaw the purchase and shipment of weapons and supplies. He dealt with captured British prisoners and arranged prisoner exchanges. He commissioned privateers to raid British shipping. Franklin was essentially running America's foreign policy from Paris. In 1778, Franklin achieved his greatest diplomatic success when France formally recognized American independence and entered into a military alliance with the United States. This alliance brought French troops, ships, and money to America's aid. It transformed the Revolutionary War from a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Without French support, American independence would not have been possible. Franklin's diplomacy in France was as important to American victory as Washington's generalship on the battlefield. Franklin remained in France throughout the Revolutionary War, continuing to secure French aid and support. He lived in a suburb of Paris called Passy, where he entertained visitors, conducted scientific experiments, and managed diplomatic affairs. He was beloved by the French people and respected by French officials. When the war ended with American victory in 1781, Franklin was chosen as one of the American commissioners to negotiate the peace treaty with Britain. The negotiations were complex and difficult, involving not just America and Britain but also France, Spain, and other European powers. Franklin worked alongside John Adams and John Jay to secure favorable terms for America. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence and established generous boundaries for the new nation. It was a diplomatic triumph that secured the gains won on the battlefield. Franklin finally returned to America in 1785 at age 79. He had been away for 9 years. He was old, tired, and in poor health, but he received a hero's welcome in Philadelphia. He hoped to retire quietly to his home, but his country still needed him. In 1787, Franklin was chosen as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. At age 81, he was by far the oldest delegate. He was too weak to stand for long periods, so his speeches were read by others. But his presence and wisdom were invaluable. The Constitutional Convention was deeply divided between large states and small states, between those who wanted a strong central government and those who feared tyranny. Compromise seemed impossible at times. Franklin used his humor, his prestige, and his diplomatic skills to help bridge divides and build consensus. On the final day of the convention, Franklin gave a speech urging all delegates to sign the Constitution despite their reservations. He said that he did not entirely approve of the Constitution, but he doubted whether any other convention could produce a better one. He urged unity and compromise. His speech helped persuade reluctant delegates to sign. Franklin was one of only 6 men who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the 2 founding documents of American democracy. In his final years, Franklin remained active in public affairs. He served as president of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. Franklin had owned slaves earlier in his life, but he came to believe that slavery was morally wrong and economically harmful. In 1790, just months before his death, Franklin signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. It was one of his last public acts. Franklin died at his home in Philadelphia on April 17, 1790, at age 84. He was surrounded by his family. His death was mourned throughout America and Europe. 20,000 people attended his funeral in Philadelphia, the largest public gathering in American history to that time. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning for Franklin, an unprecedented honor for a foreigner. Benjamin Franklin's legacy is immense and multifaceted. He was a self-made man who rose from poverty to wealth through hard work and intelligence. He was a brilliant writer whose clear, witty prose influenced American literature. He was a scientist whose experiments with electricity advanced human knowledge. He was an inventor whose practical innovations improved daily life. He was a civic leader who founded institutions that strengthened his community. He was a diplomat whose skill and charm secured foreign support for American independence. He was a founding father who helped create the American nation. Franklin embodied the American ideal of self-improvement and opportunity. He proved that in America, a poor boy with talent and determination could achieve greatness. Franklin believed in reason, progress, and the perfectibility of human society. He believed that through education, hard work, and civic virtue, people could create a better world. These beliefs shaped American culture and continue to influence it today. Benjamin Franklin was truly one of the most remarkable men in American history, a Renaissance man whose achievements spanned multiple fields and whose impact continues to be felt centuries after his death. James Madison was a Virginia scholar and political philosopher who became the architect of American democracy. James Madison, the 4th United States President, was born in Port Conway, Virginia on March 16, 1751. He came from a prosperous planter family. He had a slight frame and quiet demeanor. Madison's family estate was substantial. He was educated by private tutors before attending the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, where he studied history, government, and law. Then in 1771, after completing his studies, the young Madison returned to Virginia where he immersed himself in political philosophy and the rights of citizens. James Madison was born into a slave-owning family. The Madison plantation relied on enslaved labor. In 1774, when tensions between the colonies and Britain intensified, Madison joined the local Committee of Safety. Madison, though physically frail, was passionate about liberty and colonial rights. Madison began his political career in earnest during the Revolutionary period. He served on Virginia's Constitutional Convention in 1776. He was instrumental in drafting Virginia's Constitution and advocating for religious freedom. Madison believed deeply that government should not interfere with matters of conscience. He worked alongside Thomas Jefferson to establish the principle of separation of church and state in Virginia. In 1780, Madison was elected to the Continental Congress. He was one of the youngest delegates but quickly became one of the most influential voices. Madison witnessed firsthand the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The national government had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, and no executive branch to enforce laws. States acted like independent nations, and the Union was falling apart. Madison returned to Virginia in 1783, deeply concerned about the future of the American experiment. He studied ancient and modern confederacies, reading hundreds of books on government, history, and political theory. Madison became convinced that America needed a stronger national government, one that could unite the states while protecting individual liberty. In 1787, Madison was elected to represent Virginia at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Madison arrived in Philadelphia early, prepared like no other delegate. He had drafted what became known as the Virginia Plan, a blueprint for an entirely new form of government. The Virginia Plan proposed 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. It called for a bicameral legislature with representation based on population. It established the principle of checks and balances. Madison's plan became the foundation for the debates that followed. Throughout that hot summer of 1787, Madison was the intellectual force behind the Constitution. He spoke more than 200 times during the convention. He took detailed notes of every session, creating the only comprehensive record of the debates. Madison understood that compromise was essential. He negotiated between large states and small states, between northern states and southern states, between those who wanted a strong national government and those who feared tyranny. The Great Compromise created a Senate with equal representation for all states and a House of Representatives based on population. The Three-Fifths Compromise, though morally troubling, allowed southern states to count enslaved people for representation purposes, a concession Madison accepted to keep the convention from collapsing. Madison believed in a government of limited powers, with authority divided between the national government and the states. He championed the concept of federalism, where power flows from the people and is distributed across multiple levels of government. Madison feared the tyranny of the majority as much as the tyranny of kings. He designed a system where ambition would counteract ambition, where no single faction could dominate, where minority rights would be protected. When the Constitution was completed in September 1787, the battle for ratification began. Madison joined forces with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to write a series of essays defending the Constitution. These essays, known as the Federalist Papers, are among the most important political writings in American history. Madison wrote 29 of the 85 essays. His most famous contribution was Federalist No. 10, where he argued that a large republic would protect against the dangers of faction. Madison explained that in a large, diverse nation, no single interest group could gain control. The very size and diversity of America would be its protection against tyranny. Madison traveled throughout Virginia, debating opponents of the Constitution. Many Americans feared that the new government would destroy state sovereignty and individual liberty. Patrick Henry, Madison's fellow Virginian, warned that the Constitution created a dangerous concentration of power. Madison responded that the Constitution was carefully designed to prevent tyranny through separation of powers and checks and balances. In Virginia's ratifying convention, Madison's arguments proved decisive. Virginia ratified the Constitution by a narrow margin in June 1788. But Madison knew the Constitution was incomplete. Many states had ratified only with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added. Madison had initially believed a Bill of Rights was unnecessary, that the Constitution structure was sufficient protection for liberty. Thomas Jefferson convinced him otherwise. Jefferson wrote from Paris that a Bill of Rights would give the judiciary a legal check on government power and would provide a standard that people could rally around. In 1789, Madison was elected to the First United States Congress. He immediately set to work drafting amendments to the Constitution. Madison reviewed more than 200 proposed amendments from the state ratifying conventions. He distilled them into 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified and became the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment protected freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The Second Amendment protected the right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment protected against self-incrimination. The Eighth Amendment prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. Madison's Bill of Rights completed the Constitution and secured the fundamental liberties that Americans cherish. Madison became a trusted advisor to President George Washington. He helped draft Washington's inaugural address and many of his important speeches. But Madison soon found himself at odds with Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton wanted a powerful national government that would promote manufacturing and commerce. He proposed that the federal government assume state debts from the Revolutionary War. He wanted to create a national bank. He favored high tariffs to protect American industry. Madison believed Hamilton's vision betrayed the principles of the Revolution. Madison feared that Hamilton's policies would benefit wealthy merchants and speculators at the expense of ordinary farmers. Madison opposed the national bank as unconstitutional, arguing that the Constitution did not grant Congress the power to charter a bank. Madison and Thomas Jefferson formed a political opposition to Hamilton's Federalist Party. They created the Democratic-Republican Party, which championed states' rights, agricultural interests, and strict interpretation of the Constitution. The political divisions grew bitter. When war broke out between Britain and France in 1793, the Federalists supported Britain while the Democratic Republicans sympathized with France. President Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, trying to keep America out of the European conflict. Madison supported neutrality but resented British violations of American shipping rights. In 1794, Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, a young widow from Philadelphia. Dolly Madison became one of the most beloved figures in American history. She was charming, gracious, and politically astute. She helped soften Madison's reserved personality and became his partner in political life. Their marriage was one of mutual devotion and respect. When Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800, he appointed Madison as Secretary of State. Madison served in this role for 8 years, managing America's foreign relations during a turbulent period. Britain and France were at war, and both nations violated American neutrality. British ships seized American sailors and forced them into service. Napoleon's France confiscated American ships trading with Britain. Madison tried diplomacy, but neither European power respected American rights. Jefferson and Madison tried economic pressure, imposing an embargo on foreign trade. The embargo failed, hurting American merchants more than European powers. In 1808, Madison was elected president. He inherited Jefferson's foreign policy problems. Madison continued trying to defend American rights through economic measures, but the situation deteriorated. Britain refused to stop seizing American ships and sailors. Western Americans believed Britain was encouraging Indian attacks on the frontier. A group of young congressmen called the War Hawks demanded action. They were led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. They wanted to defend American honor and perhaps conquer Canada. Madison reluctantly asked Congress to declare war on Britain in June 1812. It was a controversial decision. The Federalist Party opposed the war. New England states, whose shipping interests were hurt by the war, considered seceding from the Union. Madison faced fierce criticism. The United States was unprepared for war. The army was small and poorly trained. The Navy had only a handful of ships. State militias often refused to fight outside their borders. The war went badly for America. American attempts to invade Canada failed repeatedly. In 1814, British forces invaded the United States. They marched on Washington, D.C. Madison and his cabinet fled the capital. Dolly Madison famously saved important documents and a portrait of George Washington before escaping. The British burned the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings. It was a humiliating moment for the young nation. But America rallied. American forces won important victories at Baltimore and on Lake Champlain. Andrew Jackson defeated the British at New Orleans in January 1815, though the battle occurred after the peace treaty had been signed. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war without resolving any of the issues that caused it. Neither side gained territory. Britain did not agree to stop impressing sailors. But the war had important consequences. America had survived a second war with Britain. American nationalism grew stronger. The Federalist Party, tainted by its opposition to the war, collapsed. America turned inward, focusing on westward expansion and economic development. Madison's second term saw a transformation in his political views. The war had demonstrated the need for a stronger national government. Madison now supported many policies he had once opposed. He supported a new national bank to stabilize the currency. He supported tariffs to protect American manufacturing. He supported federal funding for roads and canals to improve transportation. Madison's critics accused him of abandoning his principles. Madison responded that circumstances had changed and that practical governance required flexibility. Madison left the presidency in 1817 and returned to his estate at Montpelier in Virginia. He spent his retirement years managing his plantation, though financial problems plagued him. Madison continued to correspond with political leaders and to advise on constitutional questions. He was called the Sage of Montpelier. Madison watched with concern as sectional tensions grew between North and South. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily resolved the question of slavery's expansion, but Madison knew it was only a temporary solution. He feared that slavery would eventually tear the nation apart. Madison struggled with the question of slavery throughout his life. He owned more than 100 slaves at Montpelier. He recognized that slavery was morally wrong and economically inefficient. He supported gradual emancipation and colonization, the idea that freed slaves should be sent to Africa. But Madison never freed his slaves during his lifetime. He believed that freed slaves could not live peacefully with whites in America. He feared that immediate emancipation would lead to racial violence. These views, though common among white Southerners of his era, represented a moral failure. Madison's inability to resolve the contradiction between his ideals of liberty and his practice of slavery diminished his legacy. Madison's final years were spent working on his papers. He carefully edited his notes from the Constitutional Convention, knowing they would be invaluable to future generations. He wanted Americans to understand the principles and compromises that created the Constitution. Madison died on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. He was the last surviving signer of the Constitution. His death marked the end of the founding generation. James Madison's legacy is complex and enduring. He was the principal architect of the Constitution, creating a framework of government that has survived for more than 2 centuries. He championed the Bill of Rights, securing the fundamental freedoms that define American liberty. He helped establish the principle of separation of church and state. He developed the theory of federalism and checks and balances. He demonstrated that Republican government could work in a large, diverse nation. Madison believed in reason, compromise, and the rule of law. He showed that political opponents could debate fiercely yet remain committed to constitutional principles. But Madison's legacy is also troubled by his relationship with slavery. He built his wealth on the labor of enslaved people. He helped enshrine slavery's protection in the Constitution through provisions like the 3/5 Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause. He failed to use his moral authority to challenge the institution that contradicted everything he claimed to believe about human rights and dignity. This failure haunted Madison and would haunt the nation he helped create. James Madison was a man of contradictions, a champion of liberty who owned slaves, an advocate of limited government who expanded federal power, a shy scholar who became a political leader. He was brilliant yet flawed, principled yet pragmatic, idealistic yet realistic. Madison understood that democracy requires constant work, that freedom is fragile, that unity demands compromise. He gave America its constitutional foundation, a system of government designed to protect liberty while enabling effective governance. Madison's Constitution has endured through civil war, economic depression, world wars, and social upheaval. It has been amended, interpreted, and reinterpreted, but its basic structure remains. That is James Madison's gift to America and to the world, a constitution that balances power and liberty, that protects minorities while respecting majorities, that divides authority while creating unity. Madison was, in the end, the father of the Constitution, the architect of American democracy, and despite his failings, one of the greatest political thinkers in human history. John Jay was a New York aristocrat and a brilliant legal mind who became one of the founding fathers of his country. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, was born in New York City on December 12, 1745. He came from a wealthy merchant family. He had a dignified and reserved bearing. Jay's family connections were influential. He was educated at King's College, now Columbia University, graduating at the age of 19 with honors in 1764. Then he studied law and was admitted to the New York Bar in 1768, quickly establishing himself as one of the most promising attorneys in the colony. John Jay was a man of privilege who owned slaves during his lifetime, though he would later become a vocal advocate for abolition. In 1774, as tensions mounted between Britain and the American colonies, Jay was elected to the First Continental Congress. He was not initially a radical revolutionary. Jay hoped for reconciliation with Britain. He drafted petitions seeking compromise and peaceful resolution to the growing conflict between the colonies and the Crown. John Jay was among the more conservative delegates who believed in exhausting every diplomatic option before resorting to armed rebellion. He feared the chaos that revolution might bring. But as Britain continued its harsh policies and refused to address colonial grievances, Jay's position evolved. When independence became inevitable, he committed himself fully to the Patriot cause. In 1776, Jay returned to New York where he helped draft the state's first constitution. He was appointed Chief Justice of New York, a position that demonstrated the respect his legal expertise commanded. Jay worked tirelessly to establish a functioning court system in the midst of war. New York was a critical battleground, and Jay's leadership helped maintain civil order even as military conflicts raged. But Jay's talents were needed beyond New York's borders. In 1778, he was elected president of the Continental Congress. This was largely a ceremonial position, but it placed Jay at the center of the revolutionary government. He served during one of the most difficult periods of the war when American fortunes seemed darkest. Jay worked to maintain unity among the fractious colonies and to secure the resources needed to continue the fight. Then in 1779, Congress sent Jay to Spain as a diplomatic envoy. His mission was to secure recognition, financial support, and an alliance with the Spanish crown. Jay spent nearly 3 frustrating years in Spain. The Spanish government was reluctant to recognize American independence, fearing it might inspire rebellions in their own colonial empire. Jay negotiated tirelessly but achieved limited success. Spain provided some covert financial assistance but refused formal recognition or alliance. The experience taught Jay valuable lessons about European power politics and the precarious position of the new American nation. In 1782, Jay traveled to Paris to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in negotiating the treaty to end the Revolutionary War. The peace negotiations were extraordinarily complex. The American diplomats had to navigate competing interests among Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands while securing the best possible terms for the United States. Jay played a crucial role in these negotiations. He was suspicious of French motives and convinced his fellow diplomats to negotiate separately with Britain rather than allowing France to control the process. Jay's instincts proved correct. By dealing directly with the British, the American negotiators secured far more favorable terms than they might have otherwise obtained. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, granted the United States independence and established borders that extended to the Mississippi River. This was a diplomatic triumph, and Jay deserved significant credit for the achievement. His legal precision and diplomatic skill helped secure the territorial foundation for American expansion. After the war, Jay returned to America and was appointed Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation. He served from 1784 to 1789, managing the young nation's international relations during a critical period. Jay dealt with ongoing disputes with Britain over treaty violations, negotiations with Spain over navigation rights on the Mississippi River, and the challenge of establishing American credibility on the world stage. The experience convinced Jay that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate for effective governance. Jay became a strong supporter of a new constitution that would create a more powerful federal government. He collaborated with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison to write the Federalist Papers, a series of essays arguing for ratification of the proposed constitution. Jay contributed 5 essays before illness forced him to stop writing. His essays addressed foreign policy and the dangers facing a weak, divided nation. Jay argued that a strong federal government was essential for national security and international respect. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the new government was established. George Washington became the first president, and he appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Jay was sworn in on October 19, 1789. As Chief Justice, Jay had the enormous responsibility of defining the role of the federal judiciary and establishing the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government. Jay served as Chief Justice for 6 years. During his tenure, the court heard relatively few cases, and its role was not yet clearly defined. Jay worked to establish the court's dignity and independence. He insisted on proper courtroom decorum and procedures. Jay authored several important opinions that began to define federal judicial power. He established the principle that the Supreme Court would not issue advisory opinions, maintaining the court's independence from the executive and legislative branches. But Jay found the Chief Justice position frustrating in many ways. The Supreme Court met only briefly each year, and much of a justice's time was spent riding circuit, traveling to hear cases in lower federal courts across the country. The travel was exhausting and took Jay away from his family for months at a time. The Supreme Court had not yet established itself as the powerful institution it would later become, and Jay felt his talents were underutilized. In 1794, while still serving as Chief Justice, Jay accepted a diplomatic mission that would define his legacy and prove enormously controversial. Relations between the United States and Britain had deteriorated badly since the Revolutionary War. Britain refused to evacuate military posts in the Northwest Territory as required by the Treaty of Paris. British ships seized American vessels trading with France, with whom Britain was at war. The two nations seemed headed toward another conflict that the young United States could ill afford. President Washington sent Jay to London to negotiate a treaty that would resolve these disputes and preserve peace. Jay negotiated for months with the British government. The resulting agreement, known as Jay's Treaty, was signed in November 1794. The treaty required Britain to evacuate the Northwest posts by 1796 and established commissions to resolve various financial claims between the two nations. It granted the United States limited trading rights with British colonies. But Jay's treaty failed to address many American grievances. It did not secure British recognition of American neutral trading rights. It did not provide compensation for slaves carried away by British forces during the war. It required the United States to repay pre-war debts to British merchants, an unpopular provision. Many Americans viewed the treaty as a humiliating capitulation to British demands. When the treaty's terms became public in 1795, Jay was vilified across the country. Angry mobs burned him in effigy. He joked that he could travel across America by the light of his burning effigies. Democratic-Republican societies organized protests against the treaty and against Jay personally. Critics accused him of betraying American interests and selling out to the British. The treaty became a focal point for the growing partisan divide between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But Jay and the Federalists argued that the treaty, while imperfect, preserved peace and provided time for the young nation to grow stronger. War with Britain would have been catastrophic for American commerce and security. The treaty secured British withdrawal from the Northwest Territory, opening that region for American settlement. It established a framework for resolving disputes through arbitration rather than warfare. Jay believed he had achieved the best terms possible given America's weak bargaining position. The Senate ratified Jay's treaty by the narrowest possible margin in 1795. President Washington signed it despite his own reservations. The treaty accomplished its primary goal of preventing war with Britain. It also had the unintended effect of accelerating the formation of political parties in America, as Federalists and Democratic Republicans organized to support or oppose the treaty. While Jay was in London negotiating the treaty, he was elected governor of New York. He resigned as Chief Justice in 1795 and served 2 terms as governor until 1801. As governor, Jay focused on legal and prison reform. He was a strong advocate for the gradual abolition of slavery in New York. In 1799, he signed legislation that provided for the gradual emancipation of slaves in the state. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4, 1799 would be freed after serving their mother's owner for a period of years. This law put New York on the path to ending slavery, though complete abolition would not come until 1827. Jay's support for abolition was genuine and consistent, though he himself had owned slaves earlier in his life. He freed his own slaves and became president of the New York Manumission Society, which worked to end slavery and protect free blacks from kidnapping. Jay believed slavery was incompatible with the principles of the Revolution and that it corrupted both enslaved and enslaver. His advocacy helped establish New York as a center of the abolitionist movement. After serving as governor, Jay retired from public life in 1801 at the age of 55. He retired to his farm in Bedford, New York, where he lived for another 28 years. Jay declined several offers to return to public service, including a reappointment as Chief Justice. He preferred the quiet life of a gentleman farmer. He remained interested in public affairs but participated only from a distance. Jay devoted his retirement to his family, his farm, and his religious faith. He was a devout Episcopalian and served as president of the American Bible Society from 1821 until his death. He maintained correspondence with old friends and colleagues, offering advice when asked but never seeking to return to the political arena. Jay read extensively and reflected on the great events he had witnessed and helped shape. John Jay died at his home in Bedford on May 17, 1829, at the age of 83. He had lived to see the nation he helped create survive and prosper beyond what many had thought possible. The United States had expanded westward, weathered political crises, survived another war with Britain in 1812, and established itself as a growing power. Jay had played crucial roles at every stage of the nation's founding, from the Continental Congress through the Revolution, the peace negotiations, the ratification of the Constitution, and the early federal government. Jay's legacy is complex and multifaceted. As a diplomat, he helped secure American independence and later preserved peace with Britain through his controversial treaty. As Chief Justice, he helped establish the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court's independence. As governor, he advanced the cause of abolition in New York. As a political thinker, his contributions to the Federalist Papers helped secure ratification of the Constitution. But Jay is often overlooked among the Founding Fathers. He lacks the fame of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, or Hamilton. His reserved personality and aristocratic bearing made him less popular than more charismatic leaders. His diplomatic achievements, while significant, were often controversial and lacked the dramatic appeal of military victories. Jay's treaty, his most important diplomatic accomplishment, made him deeply unpopular during his lifetime. Yet historians have come to appreciate Jay's essential contributions to American independence and constitutional government. His diplomatic skill helped win the Revolutionary War and prevent another war a decade later. His legal expertise helped establish the rule of law in the new nation. His political judgment, though conservative, provided stability during a turbulent era. His advocacy for abolition, though gradual, placed him on the right side of history's greatest moral question. John Jay was a man who served his country in every branch of government and in multiple capacities. He was a legislator, a judge, a diplomat, and an executive. He helped write both a state constitution and essays defending the federal constitution. He negotiated treaties, decided cases, and governed a state. Few Americans have served their country in so many different ways or with such consistent dedication. Jay embodied the ideal of the citizen statesman who serves out of duty rather than ambition. He accepted difficult assignments, endured criticism and abuse, and ultimately stepped away from power to live as a private citizen. He was not a military hero or a revolutionary firebrand. He was a lawyer and diplomat who used his intellect and judgment to help build a nation. In the end, John Jay was the indispensable diplomat whose quiet competence helped secure American independence and establish the foundations for constitutional government. Samuel Adams was a Boston firebrand and a passionate revolutionary who became known as the father of the American Revolution. Samuel Adams, a founding father and political philosopher, was born in Boston, Massachusetts on September 27, 1722. He came from a prosperous merchant family. He had an intense and unwavering commitment to liberty. Adams's business ventures were largely unsuccessful. He was educated at Harvard College, graduating in 1740 at the age of 18. He later earned a master's degree from Harvard in 1743. Then his father's brewery business fell into decline and the young Adams proved to be a poor businessman, more interested in politics than profits. Samuel Adams was a man of modest means who struggled financially throughout much of his life. He inherited his father's failing brewery in 1748. When the British began tightening their control over the American colonies in the 1760s, Adams, a tax collector in Boston, became increasingly vocal in his opposition to Crown policies. Adams organized resistance against the British taxation measures. He was a master propagandist who understood the power of public opinion. He knew how to rally the common people to the cause of independence. In 1764, Adams began writing articles opposing the Sugar Act. He argued that taxation without representation was tyranny. The British Parliament had no right to tax the colonies because the colonists had no representatives in Parliament. This became the rallying cry of the revolutionary movement. Adams was not a wealthy plantation owner like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. He was a man of the people who spoke directly to the concerns of ordinary colonists. Samuel Adams was one of the most radical voices calling for independence from Britain. He was far more extreme than many of his contemporaries. While others sought compromise and reconciliation with the mother country, Adams believed that complete separation was the only acceptable solution. He saw British rule as fundamentally incompatible with colonial liberty. Adams helped organize the Sons of Liberty in 1765. This secret organization used both peaceful protest and intimidation to resist British policies. The Sons of Liberty became famous for their opposition to the Stamp Act. They burned effigies of tax collectors and destroyed the homes of British officials. Adams was almost certainly involved in planning these actions, though he was careful to maintain plausible deniability. He understood that the revolution needed respectable leaders who could not be easily arrested for sedition. Adams worked behind the scenes, organizing meetings, writing pamphlets, and coordinating resistance activities. In 1768, British troops arrived in Boston to maintain order and enforce unpopular laws. Adams called this a military occupation. He wrote inflammatory articles describing the soldiers as an invading army. He deliberately provoked confrontations between colonists and British troops. Adams understood that violence would radicalize moderate colonists and push them toward the revolutionary cause. He was willing to sacrifice peace for the greater goal of independence. On March 5, 1770, tensions between Bostonians and British soldiers exploded into violence. A confrontation on King Street resulted in British troops firing into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 men. Adams immediately recognized the propaganda value of this tragedy. He called it the Boston Massacre. He organized elaborate funeral processions for the victims. He commissioned engravings showing British soldiers deliberately murdering innocent civilians. The reality was more complicated, but Adams was not interested in nuance. He wanted to inflame public opinion against the British. Samuel Adams served in the Massachusetts legislature where he was a constant thorn in the side of royal governors. He drafted resolutions asserting colonial rights. He organized committees of correspondence to coordinate resistance activities across different colonies. These committees became the communication network that would eventually unite the colonies in revolution. Adams was building the infrastructure of rebellion years before the actual war began. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. This was seen as another example of British tyranny. Adams organized a mass meeting at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. Thousands of colonists gathered to protest the Tea Act. When the royal governor refused to send the tea ships back to England, Adams gave a signal. That night, members of the Sons of Liberty, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance that shocked both Britain and many moderate colonists. Adams had orchestrated an act of vandalism that destroyed thousands of pounds worth of private property. The British response was swift and severe. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which Bostonians called the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts's charter, and imposed direct military rule. Adams had gotten exactly what he wanted: British overreach that would radicalize even moderate colonists. Samuel Adams was a master of political theater. He understood that symbols and dramatic gestures could be more powerful than reasoned arguments. He organized public spectacles, coordinated protests, and ensured that every British action was portrayed in the worst possible light. He was not interested in balanced reporting or fair representation of British motives. He wanted to create an unbridgeable divide between the colonies and the mother country. In September 1774, Adams was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. This gathering brought together representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies to coordinate a response to British oppression. Adams was one of the most radical voices at the Congress. Many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Adams had no such illusions. He believed that war was inevitable and that independence was the only acceptable outcome. When the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, the Revolutionary War had already begun. British troops and colonial militia had exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord. Adams had been at Lexington on the night before the battle. British troops had orders to arrest Adams and John Hancock, another prominent revolutionary. The 2 men escaped just hours before the British arrived. Adams was now a wanted man, accused of treason against the Crown. Samuel Adams was not a military leader. He never commanded troops in battle. His contribution to the revolution was political and ideological. He kept the revolutionary spirit alive during the darkest days of the war. He argued for independence when others wavered. He insisted that the colonies were fighting not just for better treatment within the British Empire but for the right to govern themselves as free and independent states. In July 1776, the Continental Congress debated and approved the Declaration of Independence. Samuel Adams was one of the signers of this historic document. By putting his name on the declaration, Adams committed treason in the eyes of the British government. If the revolution failed, he would be hanged. Adams never hesitated. He had been working toward this moment for more than a decade. American independence was the cause to which he had dedicated his life. During the Revolutionary War, Adams continued to serve in the Continental Congress. He worked on committees dealing with military supplies, finance, and foreign affairs. He was not a brilliant administrator or a diplomatic negotiator. His strength was his unwavering commitment to the cause of independence. When others grew discouraged by military defeat or the hardships of war, Adams remained resolute. He believed that the American cause was just and that victory was inevitable. Samuel Adams understood that winning the war was not enough. The new nation needed a strong foundation of Republican principles. He was deeply suspicious of centralized power. He believed that government should be close to the people and that individual liberty should be protected from government overreach. These beliefs would shape his political philosophy for the rest of his life. After the war ended in 1783, Adams returned to Massachusetts politics. He served in the state Senate and was elected president of that body. He was a strong advocate for a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a new framework for the national government, Adams was not a delegate. He was initially skeptical of the proposed constitution. He worried that it created too strong a central government that could threaten individual liberty and state sovereignty. Adams was part of the anti-federalist movement that opposed ratification of the Constitution. He feared that the new government would become as tyrannical as the British government the colonies had fought to escape. He wanted explicit protections for individual rights. He demanded amendments that would limit federal power and protect freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Only after the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights did Adams support ratification. In 1789, Samuel Adams was elected Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts under Governor John Hancock. When Hancock died in 1793, Adams became governor. He served for one-year terms as governor from 1794 to 1797. As governor, Adams was a champion of public education and religious freedom. He supported policies that would help ordinary citizens rather than wealthy elites. He remained true to his revolutionary principles, believing that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Samuel Adams was a man of deep religious conviction. He was a Puritan who believed that America had a special destiny. He saw the American Revolution as part of God's plan to create a society based on liberty and virtue. Adams believed that a republic could only survive if its citizens were moral and virtuous. He worried that luxury and corruption would undermine the revolutionary ideals for which so many had fought and died. Unlike George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams was never a wealthy man. He lived simply and died with little money. He never owned slaves. He believed that slavery was incompatible with the principles of the American Revolution. How could a nation founded on the idea that all men are created equal tolerate the enslavement of human beings? Adams was one of the earliest American political leaders to oppose slavery on moral grounds. Samuel Adams was not a great orator like Patrick Henry. He was not a brilliant writer like Thomas Jefferson. He was not a military hero like George Washington. His genius was in organization and agitation. He knew how to build networks of resistance. He understood how to use propaganda to shape public opinion. He was willing to push events toward crisis when others sought compromise. Without Samuel Adams, the American Revolution might never have happened. Adams was sometimes called the last Puritan because he embodied the stern moral values of an earlier generation. He dressed plainly and lived frugally. He disapproved of fancy clothing, elaborate entertainments, and displays of wealth. He believed that the American Republic needed citizens who valued virtue over luxury, duty over pleasure, and the common good over individual gain. These values seemed old-fashioned even in his own time, but Adams never wavered in his convictions. In his later years, Samuel Adams watched as the nation he had helped create began to develop in ways he had not anticipated. Political parties emerged, dividing Americans into competing factions. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, favored a strong central government and close ties with Britain. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, favored limited federal power and sympathy with revolutionary France. Samuel Adams generally sided with the Democratic Republicans, though he was too old to play an active role in national politics. Samuel Adams retired from public life in 1797 at the age of 75. He had served the cause of American independence for more than 3 decades. He had risked his life, his fortune, and his reputation for the revolutionary cause. He had helped transform 13 British colonies into an independent nation. He had lived to see the Constitution ratified and the Bill of Rights adopted. He had witnessed the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, proving that a republic could function without a king. On October 2, 1803, Samuel Adams died at his home in Boston at the age of 81. He was buried in the Granary Burying Ground alongside other patriots of the Revolution. Thousands of Bostonians lined the streets for his funeral procession. They mourned the passing of one of the last surviving leaders of the Revolution. Adams had outlived most of his revolutionary comrades. He had seen the nation survive its difficult birth and establish itself as a stable republic. Samuel Adams's legacy is complex and sometimes controversial. He was a radical who was willing to use violence and intimidation to achieve political goals. He was a propagandist who manipulated public opinion and distorted facts to serve his cause. He was an agitator who deliberately provoked conflicts that led to bloodshed. Yet he was also a man of principle who dedicated his life to the cause of human liberty. He believed passionately in self-government and individual rights. He helped create a nation founded on the revolutionary idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Without Samuel Adams, there might have been no Boston Tea Party, no committees of correspondence, no unified colonial resistance to British rule. He was the man who kept the revolutionary fire burning when others were ready to compromise. He was the agitator who made independence seem not just desirable but necessary. He was the organizer who built the networks that would sustain the revolutionary movement through years of war and hardship. Samuel Adams was truly the father of the American Revolution, the man who more than any other individual made American independence possible. He was not the most famous founder, not the most celebrated revolutionary leader, but he was perhaps the most essential. Without his tireless agitation, his brilliant propaganda, and his unwavering commitment to independence, the American Revolution might never have occurred. He was the spark that ignited the flame of liberty, and that flame continues to burn more than 2 centuries after his death.